Right now, on every map in every classroom in America, there are names printed in bold letters across the African continent. Names that feel ancient, names that feel official, names that feel like they have always been there. But here is what those maps will never tell you. Most of those names were invented. They were written down for the first time not by African kings or African scholars, but by European administrators sitting in offices thousands of miles away, trying to carve up a continent they had never walked through. Think about that for a second. Imagine someone showed up to your hometown, crossed out the name on every road sign, renamed your streets after their own generals, and then told your children that those new names had always been there, that the old names never existed, that there was nothing before them. That is not a metaphor. That is documented history. And it happened to 10 of the most storied lands on the African continent. Today, we are going to do something simple but powerful. We are going to say the real names out loud. We are going to find out what they meant, who built the civilizations behind them, and why those names were so threatening that an entire colonial bureaucracy worked to erase them from the historical record. Stay with me through this entire video, because by the end, I promise you, you will never look at a map of Africa the same way again. And before we even begin, I want to know something from you right now. Do you think renaming a land is just a practical administrative decision, or is it a deliberate act of cultural erasure? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see where this audience stands. Before we get into the 10 names, we need to understand the machinery behind the erasure. In 1884 and 1885, the major European powers, Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, and others, gathered in Berlin, Germany for a conference that Africans were not invited to attend. At this conference, they drew lines across the African continent, dividing it into colonies and spheres of influence. They did not consult the people who lived there. They did not ask what those lands were already called. They simply drew the lines, assigned their own names, and declared it done. This event, known as the Berlin Conference, is often called the Scramble for Africa. And one of its quietest but most lasting consequences was the systematic replacement of indigenous names with European ones. Names were not just administrative labels. In most African linguistic traditions, the name of a place carried history inside it. A name told you what happened there, who built there, what resources were nearby, which ancestors were honored in that soil. When you erased the name, you did not just change a word, you cut the living connection between a people and their own story. Now let us go through the 10 lands, and let us say the real names. The first name on our list is one of the most poetically documented cases of colonial renaming in all of African history. The land we call Zimbabwe today was known in the Shona language as Zimbabwe, and that word translates with remarkable precision. It means the great stone houses, or in a more expansive rendering, the dwelling place of chiefs built from stone. This was not a poetic flourish, it was a literal description. At the heart of what is now Zimbabwe stood one of the greatest architectural achievements in the ancient world, a massive stone city built without mortar, without cement, without any binding material at all, just stone fitted precisely against stone, walls up to 11 meters high and 5 meters thick, enclosing a settlement that archaeologists estimate housed between 10 and 18,000 people at its peak. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe, which dominated the region from roughly the 11th to the 15th century, grew wealthy not through conquest alone, but through trade. Archaeological excavations at the site have uncovered Chinese porcelain from the Song and Ming dynasties, Persian glassware, and Arab coins, all evidence of a sophisticated trading network that connected the interior of southern Africa to the coast of the Indian Ocean, and from there to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. The Arab geographer al-Idrisi, writing in the 12th century, referenced a kingdom in the southern interior of Africa known for its gold and its stone structures. His descriptions align closely with what archaeologists have found at the Great Zimbabwe site. When European colonizers arrived and encountered these ruins, many of them refused to believe that Africans had built them. Some proposed, without evidence, that the structures were built by Phoenicians or by some lost civilization from outside Africa. The colonial administration under Cecil Rhodes actively suppressed archaeological findings that pointed to indigenous African origins, because acknowledging those origins would have undermined the colonial narrative that Africa had no history worth preserving. The name Zimbabwe, the stone houses, was replaced by the colonial designation Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes himself. When the country gained independence in 1980, it chose to reclaim a form of its original name, Zimbabwe, a direct echo of Zimbabwe. One name survived. It took 100 years, but it survived. Here's a question for the comments. The modern country of Ghana does not actually overlap with the ancient Ghana Empire. The ancient empire was located hundreds of miles to the northwest, in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. So why did the newly independent nation choose that name in 1957? The answer tells us everything about what names mean to people who have had theirs taken away. The land of Ghana, in its ancient form, was known as Ouagadougou. This was the name used by its own people, the Soninke, for their kingdom, their homeland, the territory they ruled and farmed and traded through for centuries. Ouagadougou meant something close to the land of herds, or the land where cattle graze. It was a name rooted in the practical realities of a pastoral and agricultural people who had organized themselves into one of the most powerful states in the medieval world. The Ghana Empire, which outsiders called Ghana because that was the title of the king, not the name of the state, controlled the gold and salt trade routes across the Western Sahara for several centuries, reaching its peak around the 9th and 10th centuries. Arab scholars and traders who crossed the Sahara wrote about Ouagadougou with genuine astonishment. The geographer al-Bakri, writing in 1068, described a royal court of extraordinary wealth, a capital city with multiple districts, thousands of soldiers under arms, and a system of taxation on trade that made the king among the wealthiest rulers on earth. The gold that flowed through Ouagadougou connected West Africa to North Africa, to the Arab world, and through Arab merchants to Europe and Asia. Historians have estimated that at certain periods, Ouagadougou may have been supplying a significant portion of the gold in circulation across the entire medieval world. When the British colonized the territory that is now Ghana, they called it the Gold Coast, a name that told you exactly what they were there for. The people who had lived there for thousands of years, who had built kingdoms and trade networks and legal traditions, were reduced in the colonial name to a source of extraction. In 1957, when Kwame Nkrumah led the Gold Coast to independence as the first sub-Saharan African country to break free from colonial rule, he chose the name Ghana, reaching back to the ancient empire as a declaration that African history did not begin with European contact. The name Ouagadougou has largely faded, but it deserves to be remembered. In 1235, in the western Sudan region of Africa, a man named Sundiata Keita did something that the most of the world has never heard of. He gathered a coalition of smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms, led them in a decisive military campaign against the dominant power of the region, and forged what would become one of the largest and wealthiest empires in world history. The state he founded was known as Manden Kurufaba. The word Manden refers to the heartland of the Mandinka people, the river valleys and forests of the upper Niger region, and Kurufaba means roughly the Great Gathering or the Federation of the Manden. This is significant. Manden Kurufaba was not simply a conquest empire. It was, in its original conception, a confederation, a voluntary gathering of peoples under a shared political framework. The Kurukan Fuga, the charter that Sundiata is said to have proclaimed after his victory, is one of the earliest known documents of collective governance in human history, establishing rules for how different peoples within the confederation would relate to one another, how land would be managed, and how disputes would be resolved. The Mali Empire grew across the 13th and 14th centuries to encompass much of West Africa, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Niger Bend, controlling the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure, the salt mines of Tagaza, and the trade routes that connected them. And then there was Mansa Musa. In 1324, the Emperor of Mali made a pilgrimage to Mecca with a retinue that contemporary sources described as including tens of thousands of attendants and soldiers, along with camels and horses carrying enormous quantities of gold. When Mansa Musa passed through Cairo, he distributed so much gold that he reportedly caused significant inflation in the Egyptian economy that lasted for over a decade. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler and scholar who visited the Mali Empire in 1352, wrote detailed accounts of its cities, its justice system, its market economy, and its security, noting with evident surprise that a lone traveler in Mali had nothing to fear from theft or assault. The French colonizers who arrived in the 19th century called the territory French Sudan. Later, at independence, it took the name Mali, a French approximation of the old empire name. The original name, Manden Kurufaba, is rarely spoken outside academic circles today. What do you think? Is it enough to approximate an ancient name, or does something get lost in that approximation? Leave your thoughts below. This one is a little different from the others, and it is fascinating precisely because of that difference. The name Mozambique comes from a real person, an Arab Swahili trader and leader named Musa al-Bikay, who controlled the island now known as Mozambique Island in the 15th century. When the Portuguese arrived in 1498 under Vasco da Gama, they recorded the island by a distorted version of its ruler's name, and eventually applied that name to the entire colonial territory. But the broader region that became Portuguese Mozambique was known by a different and far older political identity. The dominant political entity in the region before Portuguese colonization was the Mutapa Empire, also known as Mwene Mutapa, which means Great Pillager or Lord of the Conquered Lands in the Shona language. The Mutapa state controlled the plateau between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers and was the political successor to the Great Zimbabwe civilization we discussed earlier. The Portuguese initially established a trading relationship with Mutapa, exchanging cloth and glass beads for gold and ivory. Over time, through a combination of military pressure, manipulation of internal succession disputes, and exploitation of trade dependencies, they gradually undermined and subordinated the kingdom. By the time the territory was formally organized as a Portuguese colony, the name Mutapa, the name that the people of that region had used for their own political identity for centuries, had been largely eclipsed. The country that gained independence in 1975 kept the colonial name Mozambique. The name Mutapa is now known primarily to historians. The Kingdom of Benin is one of the most well-documented pre-colonial African states in the historical record, and the story of its naming is one of the most tangled. The kingdom that Europeans came to call Benin was not called Benin by its own people. The Edo people who inhabited and ruled this kingdom called it Igodo Migodo in its earliest period, meaning the land of Igodo after a legendary early ruler. As the kingdom centralized under a series of powerful rulers called the Oba, it became known by a name derived from the Yoruba term Ile Ibinu, meaning the land of vexation, a name reportedly given by neighboring Yoruba peoples, possibly referring to the fierceness of its warriors. The Portuguese, arriving on the coast in the late 15th century, heard a version of this name and wrote it down as Bini or Benin. That colonial rendering stuck in European records and eventually became the official designation under British rule, known as the Protectorate of Benin, and later folded into British Nigeria. What the Kingdom of Benin produced, under whatever name it was called, was extraordinary. The Benin bronzes, a collection of metal plaques, sculptures, and ceremonial objects created by Edo craftsmen from roughly the 13th century onward, represent one of the most sophisticated artistic traditions in human history. When British forces sacked the Royal Palace in 1897 and carried approximately 3,000 of these objects back to Britain, European scholars were so stunned by their technical and aesthetic quality that many initially refused to believe they were African in origin. Most of those objects remain in European museums today, and the kingdom whose craftsmen made them is known by a name that was never its own. Here is a story that goes in the other direction. When Upper Volta, a landlocked territory in West Africa named by French colonizers for the upper reaches of the Volta River, gained independence in 1960, it kept its colonial name. For over 2 decades, it remained Upper Volta, a French name, a name that described a river basin, not a people or a civilization. In 1984, a revolutionary leader named Thomas Sankara changed that. He renamed the country Burkina Faso, drawing from the country's 2 major indigenous languages. Burkina comes from the Masi language, meaning upright or incorruptible people. Faso comes from the Jula language, meaning fatherland. The citizens became the Burkinabe, the men and women of integrity. This is one of the rare cases in post-colonial African history where a country formally rejected its colonial name and replaced it with an indigenous one. Sankara was explicit about why. He said that a people who do not know their history, their culture, or their language are a people who cannot be truly free. Burkina Faso's pre-colonial history includes the powerful Masi kingdoms, which controlled the plateau region between the Volta rivers for several centuries and successfully resisted conquest by the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, and several other regional powers. The Masi kingdoms maintained a system of governance that preserved significant local autonomy while ensuring military coordination across a wide territory. Thomas Sankara was assassinated in 1987, but the name he gave his country remains. Now, here is something I want you to weigh in on. Some historians argue that renaming a country after independence is a powerful act of reclamation. Others argue that colonial names have, by that point, become part of the identity of the people who grew up with them, and that forced renaming can create its own kind of cultural disruption. Should more African nations reclaim pre-colonial names? Tell me in the comments. Ethiopia is something of an exception in our list, but an exception that proves the rule in a powerful way. The name Ethiopia comes from a Greek root, Ethiopia, meaning land of the burned faces, a broad Greek term that ancient writers applied loosely to peoples of sub-Saharan African appearance. For much of its classical and medieval history, the Highland Empire of the Horn of Africa called itself Ethiopia in the Ge'ez language, a form that developed its own meaning within the local tradition. But during the period of European expansion, the outside world most commonly knew this empire by a different name, Abyssinia. This name comes from the Arabic Habash or Habesha, the term that Arab traders and geographers used for the peoples of the Ethiopian highlands. It is not a name the people of the empire chose for themselves. Here is why Ethiopia matters so much in a list about colonial naming. It is one of the only African states that successfully resisted European colonization outright. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II defeated an invading Italian army, the first decisive military defeat of a European colonial force by an African state in the modern era. Because Ethiopia was never formally colonized, its name was never officially replaced by a European one. For African independence movements across the continent, for Pan-Africanist thinkers in the Caribbean and the Americas, for anyone who needed proof that African civilization could not only survive but triumph, the name Ethiopia carried enormous weight. The fact that Ethiopia kept its name, imperfect, Greek-derived but its own by long adoption, while every colonized neighbor had its name erased, says something profound about what colonial renaming was really about. It was not administration, it was dominance. Few colonial namings reveal the mechanics of erasure more clearly than what happened to the territory now called the Democratic Republic of Congo. Before European contact, the dominant political power along the lower Congo River was the Kingdom of Congo. Note the spelling with a K. This kingdom was one of the most centralized and sophisticated states in Central Africa, with a population estimated at several million people at its height, a complex administrative hierarchy, a system of currency based on Nzimbu shells, and extensive trade networks reaching deep into the interior of the continent. The word Congo in the Kikongo language connects to terms meaning hunter, mountain, or great gathering. Scholars debate the precise etymology, but the identity of being Congo was a powerful and deeply felt political and cultural reality that persisted across centuries. When the Portuguese arrived on the coast in 1483, they encountered the Kingdom of Congo as a functioning state with its own diplomatic protocols. The kings of Congo exchanged ambassadors with the kings of Portugal. Congolese nobility sent their sons to be educated in Lisbon. The Kingdom of Congo adopted Christianity on its own terms in the early 16th century, integrating it with existing cosmological beliefs in ways that created a distinctly Congolese tradition. Then came the rubber trade and the Belgian Congo under King Leopold II, one of the most brutal colonial systems in the history of colonization. The territory was renamed the Belgian Congo, and later, at independence, became the Republic of Congo, then Zaire under Mobutu Sese Seko, then the Democratic Republic of Congo after Mobutu's fall. Through all of these renamings, the name Congo, the original name, has been preserved only in the Kikongo language community and in the smaller neighboring Republic of Congo. The Kingdom of Congo is one of the least taught pre-colonial African civilizations in American schools, despite having been one of the most powerful states on the continent at the time of European contact. That absence from our classrooms is not an accident. The country now called Zambia takes its name from the Zambezi River, a colonial geographic designation. But within the territory of what is now Zambia existed a powerful and highly organized state whose name was almost entirely erased by British colonization. That state was Bulozi, the kingdom of the Lozi people, also known historically as the Barotse Kingdom. Bulozi means the floodplain land in the Lozi language, and it describes with precision the physical geography of the Upper Zambezi floodplain, a vast seasonal wetland that floods each year with the rains, transforming the landscape in ways that profoundly shaped the culture and economy of the Lozi people. The Lozi Kingdom was remarkable for its management of this floodplain ecology. The annual flood cycle drove a remarkable cultural practice, the Kuamboka ceremony, in which the king and his court would move from the floodplain palace to higher ground as the waters rose, accompanied by royal drums, elaborate ceremony, and thousands of canoes. This ceremony, rooted in centuries of ecological adaptation, was a living expression of a civilization deeply connected to its land. When the British established control over the territory through the British South Africa Company in the 1890s, Bulozi was absorbed into Northern Rhodesia, a name that honored Cecil Rhodes and erased not only the Lozi Kingdom, but every other civilization in the region. At independence in 1964, the territory became Zambia. The name Bulozi persists today only as a regional identity within the country, not a national one. Here is what I want you to think about. The Lozi king, Lewanika, negotiated a treaty with the British in 1900 known as the Lochner Concession, and he believed he was entering a protectorate relationship, not surrendering sovereignty. The British later interpreted the document differently. A name, a word, a translation, the difference between those interpretations cost Bulozi its political existence. Words carry the weight of worlds. We end with the oldest and perhaps most profound erasure on our list. The territory we now call Southern Egypt and Northern Sudan was, for thousands of years, the heartland of one of the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. Its people called their kingdom Kush, or, in its earliest period, Ta Seti, meaning the land of the bow, a reference to the extraordinary archery skills of its warriors. Kush is documented in Egyptian records as far back as approximately 2400 BCE. For much of Egyptian history, Kush was Egypt's most powerful neighbor, sometimes a rival, sometimes a subject, sometimes a conqueror. In the 8th century BCE, Kushite kings moved north and conquered Egypt itself, establishing the 25th dynasty of Egypt. For roughly a century, the rulers of Kush sat on the throne of Egypt and governed one of the ancient world's most celebrated civilizations. The capital of Kush moved over time, and at its greatest period of influence, the city of Merowe, located in what is now Sudan, served as the cultural and political center of the Kushite world. Merowe had its own pyramids, its own script called Meroitic, that has been partially deciphered but not fully translated, and its own tradition of female rulers called Kandakes, who sometimes led armies in the field. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about Kush with admiration. Roman military expeditions ventured into Kushite territory and were turned back. When the Ottoman Empire, and later the British Empire, consolidated control over the Nile Valley, the ancient names Kush and Ta Seti disappeared from official geography. The region became part of Sudan, from the Arabic Bilad al-Sudan, meaning the land of the blacks. The pyramids of Merowe sat in near total obscurity in Western popular consciousness for generations, while the pyramids of Egypt to the north became one of the most recognized landmarks in the world. There are more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. That sentence stops most people cold when they first hear it, and yet almost nobody learns about Kushite civilization in school. The name Kush, Ta Seti, Merowe, these are not footnotes, they are chapters of human history that were methodically removed from the curriculum. 10 lands, 10 names erased or buried or bent out of shape by colonial administration. Ouagadougou became the Gold Coast, Mandin Kurufaba became French Sudan. Zimbabwe became Rhodesia. Bulozi became Northern Rhodesia. Igodo Migodo became the British Protectorate of Benin. Kush became part of Sudan. The Kingdom of Congo became the Belgian Congo. Each of these was not just a change of label, it was a deliberate severing of memory, of continuity, of the relationship between a people and the land their ancestors had named and built on for generations. The scholar Walter Rodney argued in his landmark work 1972 that colonialism did not just extract material resources from Africa, it extracted history, it extracted identity, it extracted the intellectual and cultural infrastructure that a civilization needs to maintain its own sense of self across generations. Names were part of that infrastructure. They were the first and most intimate form of documentation that any culture creates, the words they chose to describe where they lived and who they were. When those names were crossed out and replaced, something was lost that cannot be fully recovered by simply knowing the original word. But knowing the original word is a beginning. Wagadu, Mandin Kurufaba, Zimbabwe, Bulozi, Igodo Migodo, Ta Seti, Kush, Mwenen Tapa, Congo. Say them, remember them, teach them, because here is what history tells us with absolute consistency. Civilizations that erase the names of others do so because they understand the power of those names. They understood that as long as a people can say the name of their homeland in their own language, they have not been fully conquered. And here is my question to you, the one I want to fill the comments section today. What is the real name of the land your own ancestors came from? Not the colonial name, not the name on the modern map, the older name, if you know it, the name in the language your people spoke before anyone came to change it. Leave it in the comments, because every name that gets written down in this comments section is a piece of history being remembered, and every piece of history that gets remembered is one that cannot be erased again. If this video made you think, if it made you look something up, if it made you want to know more, subscribe, because we are just getting started. There are hundreds of stories like these waiting to be told. The real history of Africa is not a footnote, it is a library, and we are going to open it one name at a time. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I know this was a long one, but you made it, and that means something. If you want a full dedicated video on any one of these civilizations, the Kingdom of Congo, the Kushite Pyramids, Mansa Musa, and the Mali Empire, tell me in the comments. This channel exists because you keep asking questions, so keep asking. See you in the next one.